Japan's Asian allies of World War II. Immediately following the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Imperial Japan launched several invasions and assaults on European and American colonial and imperialist provinces across the Pacific Islands and Eastern Asia. Japan's empire was, however, overextended, outmanned, and facing deteriorating supplies, making it essential for them to acquire new lands for their resources and to recruit troops from their occupied territories. This would allow them to create a buffer between them and the Japanese islands and continue their expansion efforts across the Pacific and Asian continent to maintain their pressure on the Asian colonies of Britain, the Netherlands, Australia, France, New Zealand, and the United States. Anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist sentiment was a continuous strain on Euro-American Asian relations, and nationalist movements for independence sprung up throughout the continent. Japan as a modern nation was born at the height of the imperialist age and had emerged as a powerful, strong, and industrious nation with ambitions of expansion that would rival Europe's and the United States. After Japan had defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, Korea had become a Japanese protectorate, and by the end of August 1910, the whole of the Korean peninsula was annexed to become part of Japan. By the 1920s, the Japanese knew their strength in Asia was limited, both in manpower and in resources. Korea provided them with a strong labor force and some of the most important natural resources to help give them the materials they would need to combat their opponents. The Koreans, who had been forcibly incorporated into Japanese culture, law, and society, were made to serve the Japanese throughout the course of the 1920s until the end of the war. Following the fall of the Tsar of Russia in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution, the rise of the Soviet Union divided the nation into two factions: the White Army, the internationally supported royalists and anti-communists, and the Communist Red Army. When support from the international community crumbled, the White Army was forced into exile to southeastern Russia to escape the wrath of the Soviet Union, and eventually they provided troops for the Japanese in China, Mongolia, Manchuria, Korea, and southeastern Russia. In the early 1930s, Manchuria, the southeasternmost region of the Soviet Union, and Inner Mongolia lay under Japanese control. Japan recognized the general unrest against the foreign colonists and imperialists as an opportunity to expand their own domain, establishing the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, or GEA-CPS. This was a proposal by Japan to encourage other Asian nations to resist their imperialist governments and join a financial and military alliance with Japan that would supposedly benefit the Asian continent. The GEA-CPS, however, was just a facade for Japanese imperialism, as it didn't provide the other countries within the proposed coalition with any opportunity for reciprocated success or influence. And Japan was the only state receiving any true supremacy and affluence. With the Japanese invasion and occupation of northeastern China in 1937, sparking the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese Nationalist Army started an extensive defensive war under the command of Chiang Kai-shek. Japan needed to maintain its control over its newly acquired territories and formed puppet regimes in Shanghai, Nanking, and Peking. In 1940, Wang Qingwei, a nationalist politician in Nanking, was selected by the Japanese to serve as the head of the reorganized government and form a new military body to help them with their respective missions throughout China. The Nanking Army, however, was a mixture of undisciplined bandits and militia, as well as regular Chinese military units, who had mixed loyalties to either the ebbing Chinese command or to Japanese rule. By the start of the Second World War in 1939, Imperial Japan occupied the Korean Peninsula, Inner Mongolia, northeastern China, eastern China, and southeastern Russia, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo, governed by Puyi, the last emperor of China. Puyi agreed to help Japan maintain order and defenses against the growing threats of the Soviet Army, Chinese nationalist forces, and Chinese communist paramilitaries. The military of Manchukuo was originally composed of the army of former warlord Chiang Shui-liang, who had fought against the Japanese in the Jehol province in the early 1930s. Between 1938 and 1939, a large division of the MANCHUKUO forces supported the Japanese Sixth Army in their efforts to defend against the Soviets on the Manchukuo-Mongolian border and continued to recruit troops from Mongolia to serve in their cavalry divisions. But by 1942, Japan needed more men for their operations in Siam and Burma, so they also deployed Manchukuo detachments to protect their interests there. These soldiers fought throughout the war, but were ultimately crushed in 1945 by the Soviet offensive. The survivors were eventually absorbed into the Communist Army to fight in the Chinese Civil War of 1946 to 1949. At the time of the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Second World War, Inner Mongolia, which was situated between the Mongolian People's Republic, Soviet Russia, and northeastern China, allied itself with both Japan and Manchukuo. Made up of autonomous tribes, the Inner Mongolian population provided the occupying force with troops. Led by Prince Taehuang, who was also known as Demchu Dongbram, the Inner Mongolians provided the Japanese with a powerful cavalry force to help the empire combat the Chinese in northern China and to enforce law and order in the region. Overall, however, the Inner Mongolians only provided between 4,000 and 12,000 men. By the time of Japan's defeat, they had already lost faith in the empire, but still remained loyal to Prince Wang, who was by now looking towards independence. India remained a jewel in the British Empire at the start of World War II, but many anti-British Indian nationalists sought to unify themselves with the Axis powers against Britain. By the start of 1942, during Japan's Malayan campaign, Commander Major Iwaichi Fujiwara used the pro-independence movement throughout India as a weapon to try to subvert the troops who had been fighting under British command. With the promise of being seen as an ally of Japan should they succeed against the British, Pritam Singh, an Indian activist, and POW Captain Mohan Singh of the 114th Punjab Regiment were recruited to form a Free India Army. On February 15, 1942, following the fall of Singapore to the Imperial Japanese Army, the Indian prisoners were separated from their British and Australian comrades and given better treatment to allow Captain Singh to convince them to join the cause. Over the course of 1942, the Indian POWs formed an Indian National Army, or INA, of 40,000 men strong. Captain Singh, however, quickly realized that the Japanese only had their own interests in mind, rather than helping India achieve independence. He was arrested, and the INA was disbanded, returning the POWs to the prison camps. Despite this setback, Major Fujiwara wanted to continue his efforts to push the Indian forces to ally themselves with the Japanese, and reached out to exiled Indian nationalist Subhash Chandra Bose to assist in recruiting Indian support. Bose had been a great political opponent to Mahatma Gandhi, who sought to gain India's independence from Britain through non-violent civil disobedience and peaceful protests. Bose, residing in Nazi Germany in 1941, recruited 2,000 Indian POWs to serve as the Indochine Infantry Regiment 950th, alongside the Wehrmacht in North Africa. In 1943, Bose traveled back to southern Asia and, aided by fellow anti-British revolutionary Rash Behari Bose, arrived in Singapore to lead the new INA and their civilian allies in Malaya to take the British colony and other Southeast Asian regions. The Japanese supplied the Indian Army with weapons captured from the British and used the Indian Army's 1st Division in their occupation of Burma in 1944. Used in a few engagements against the British, the Indian National Army soon found themselves abandoned by the Japanese, who were being pushed back into a retreat. The INA, their civilian allies, and the Japanese scrambled together a new combined force for an offensive in the spring of 1945 to fight in Singapore and Burma. But with the surrender of Japan a few months later, the Indian National Army surrendered their depleted forces to the Allies. Burma had always been a hotbed of anti-colonial and anti-imperialist resistance, and during World War II provided a powerful enemy against their British settlers. 30 men from the Burmese nationalist rebel group, the Takins, under the command of Aung San, were sent to Hainan, a Japanese-occupied Chinese island, for military instruction and training. Sent to Bangkok, the 30 comrades recruited 200 Burmese exiles to form the Burmese Independence Army, or BIA, a few months before the Japanese invasion of Burma in December 1941. The BIA grew in numbers, claiming to gather more than 200,000 men from the local Bamar population to fight alongside the Japanese. Aside from the initial 30 comrades, the BIA was at best an unruly mob, and the Japanese struggled to control them, so they had to be disbanded. The Japanese selected the best of the former BIA and created the Burma Defense Army, or BDA, to be trained as an auxiliary unit of the Japanese military. Burma was granted a symbolic independence from Japan in the late summer of 1943, and the BDA now became known as the Burmese National Army, or BNA. Japan refused to allow the BNA to be armed with modern weapons, and they were excluded from combat activities. Aung San realized his best option for Burma to survive was to change sides. He approached the Allies and sought to maintain independence and free Burma from the cruelty of the Japanese. In the early spring of 1945, the BNA began leading combat missions against the occupying Japanese and were supporting the Allied forces. Shortly after the war, Burma was granted its independence on January 4, 1948. By the end of the war in 1945, the Imperial Japanese forces had a strength of around 7 million. Throughout the war, this strength had been increased by its foreign troops, which were made up of Mongolians, Koreans, Han Chinese, Manchus, Indians, Burmese, and others. The Japanese had tried their best to use nationalist and anti-colonial propaganda and sentiment as a means for recruitment and occupation. It can be said, however, that independence was eventually won, but at the cost of millions of lives.